Hello, Henry.
Hello.
Hello, Laura.
Hello.
It's the wrong day for me to be in the studio. I'm sat on the wrong side of the fake living room that we have. But it's still very exciting.
Why would you normally sit
I
here?
would normally sit in that seat, yeah.
Oh, so
This
we
is what
share a
happens.
seat.
This is what happens when weekdays and weekends cross over. You
goodness
learn
me.
new things.
Well, it's very nice to have you in the wrong seat because I'm in my seat, which is normally your seat, and this is getting like kind of like Kafkaesque and all sorts of other pretentious other descriptions I could come up with. But it's very nice to have you here with us on a weekend newscast at Fleming.
And here we are talking about the BBC.
Here we are talking about the BBC, which is something that happens every now and again because from time to time things pop up about the BBC as an important national institution, not to do with what we do on Newscast at the weekends. But we will be talking about that today, as well as another couple of very important, interesting stories. And it's also Remembrance Sunday. So, shall we get into it?
Yes, plenty to talk about on this episode of Newscast.
It's Laura in the studio, in Adam's normal seat.
And it's Adam in the studio, not in his normal seat.
And it's Henry at home, and I'd be really worried if one of you were about to tell me that I'm sitting in the seat you usually sit in.
That would be really weird because it would suggest that sometimes me or Adam come and sit in your house when you're not there.
Have you ever thought about doing an episode actually just round Henry's house?
Well, we don't have time because we come off air.
Well, Adam, you do actually live very near me, so it would have been more convenient, wouldn't it, with our majority? But anyway.
So yeah,
why are we talking about the BBC?
So all this week, the Telegraph in particular have been running stories about a guy called Michael Prescott, who was an independent advisor to the BBC when it came to editorial standards and complaints and coverage. And he wrote a letter a little while ago where he highlighted several examples where he felt the BBC hadn't been impartial or hadn't been accurate. And this letter was circulated to quite a few people within the BBC, including at the highest levels. Michael Prescott obviously feels he didn't get a suitable response from the organisation. And one of the accusations is that Panorama edited a speech Donald Trump gave on January the 6th, 2021, to make it look like he said, "I'll be there with you and we fight." And actually, that's an edited version of what he said. And there was lots of words in between, "I'll be there with you and we fight."
He has criticism also of the BBC's coverage of Gaza, particularly at BBC Arabic. And he also makes criticisms of some of the BBC's coverage of trans issues. But these were all also, I think it's important to know, these were issues that were looked at and discussed in the BBC by Michael Prescott and others as part of the sort of BBC process. And what this letter was is his sort of parting shot, having been part of this process and then leaving and kind of saying, by the way, board of the BBC, here are things that have been raised and discussed and things that I feel from the tone of his letter, he clearly feels very strongly there are things that had not been taken seriously enough. So that's the kind of a bit of the context about what this letter really was. And it has led to, I think, quite a robust response from the head of the Culture Committee, which is a select committee in Parliament.
Yeah, Henry, pick up the story from a parliamentary lens.
So often what happens when there are issues concerning the BBC being discussed in public, which is not that infrequent, is that the first question is, will the Culture, Media and Sport Committee in Parliament call some of the people involved, often including representatives from the BBC, to give evidence? That committee is chaired at the moment by a Conservative former minister called Dame Caroline Dinenage, though like most select committees in Parliament, it has like all select committees in Parliament, it has an overwhelming majority of Labour MPs on it. She called Michael Prescott, the man who wrote this letter, to give evidence, although actually that was meant to happen on Wednesday. It's now not going to happen on Wednesday, is my understanding. It's going to take place at some future date because the BBC said that they were going to send a thorough response in writing to Caroline Dinenage and her committee from Samir Shah, the BBC chairman. And so Caroline Dinenage has said she and her committee want time to digest whatever it is that he says, which they will also receive tomorrow when it's made public, before they then speak to Michael Prescott. What we do know from the papers and some of the briefings to the papers today is that Samir Shah is going to apologise at the very least for the Trump issue. I don't know whether he will apologise for some of the other issues and how they were handled, but at the very least, it seems like he's going to say sorry on behalf of the BBC for the edit of that Trump speech.
And like it or not, when things go wrong at the BBC, it very quickly becomes a political issue. And there's always this sort of tension in this important relationship between the government and the BBC. The BBC, and we can never say this often enough, the BBC is independent of the government. Yet the government does have a sort of oversight view alongside the Culture Committee. And this morning, completely by coincidence, actually, Lisa Nandy, who is the Culture Secretary, who's the person who has that relationship and has a kind of bat phone to the BBC that she can phone up the Director General and have a go when things go wrong. And she, of course, is the person who's also going to have to work out the financial future of the BBC under what's known as the Charter Review. That's coming down the tracks. She happened to be in the studio with us this morning. I asked her about the Trump edit and whether she'd seen it, and also whether or not she had confidence in the BBC's leadership to sort this out. A misleading edit about a Donald Trump speech from the day of the Capitol riots in 2021. I just wonder, have you watched it, and did you think it was misleading?
Well, I have watched it. What I haven't seen is the full version of the interview versus the clips that the Panorama programme showed. But I have discussed the range of issues that that were raised in the email that was leaked to the BBC. It isn't just about the Panorama programme, although that is incredibly serious. There are a series of very serious allegations made, the most serious of which is that there is systemic bias in the way that difficult issues are reported at the BBC. I've spoken to the chairman this week. I am confident that he is treating this with the seriousness that demands, and I understand he will be reporting back to the Select Committee on Monday.
Now, I've noticed a sort of trend with Lisa Nandy when she talks about the BBC. She talks very tough, as you'd expect her to do if she was like on the side of the viewer and the listener and the reader of the website. But that doesn't always necessarily turn into like tough action or changing anything about how the BBC operates. Because, of course, her powers to do that are quite limited.
Well, they are, that's right. And the conversation and the tone that politicians take is always really important. But of course, also what they do is more important. And it's an interesting thing if we just indulge ourselves in the politics of it for a second. When there were things going wrong at the BBC, which always happens from time to time, and the Conservatives were in power, there are many people in the Conservative Party who are very unhappy about the fact that the BBC is funded by a licence fee payer. There's an ideological point among many Conservatives. It's a perfectly legitimate ideological position to have. When it comes to the Labour Party's unhappiness with the BBC, broadly speaking, while they might always not like what happens, they are sort of supportive of the concept of having the BBC. When it comes to the licence fee and the funding structure, it's not really clear that they've got an appetite for doing things in a very particularly different way. So while these things are always, I suppose, acute and sort of stressy in the way that these stories kind of happen and emerge, the political context to it is different. And I do think that's quite an important factor.
Well, I thought actually what Lisa Nandy did this morning was really interesting, because there have been various issues with the BBC over the course of this year in which Lisa Nandy has been very forthright, as you said, Adam. Very, very forthright indeed. And let's be frank, she's been incredibly critical, specifically and personally, of the Director General. She didn't go anywhere near that today at all. In fact, she took your question, Laura, about a difficult issue for the BBC and pretty quickly was talking about her discomfort with an Ofcom ruling about whether elected politicians should be allowed to present programmes on other platforms that are not the BBC. So I think in terms, look, I'm not a media correspondent, I am a political correspondent, and so I watch what politicians say very closely. And in terms of whether this felt like an issue on which Lisa Nandy and the government is going to come down on the side of those who are very annoyed with the BBC, I think if her interview with you this morning is anything to go by, the answer to that is no. And I think that is hugely politically consequential for this issue and where it goes next week.
I think you're absolutely right. And it may also be that whatever the views that have been put forward by Michael Prescott, they are, some people would make the argument, they're the views of one person who was raising issues. Where Lisa Nandy went tonto at the BBC in the summer was over the coverage of Glastonbury and what happened with the act Bob Villain, and a different set of circumstances. And she was very forthright, and she said the BBC must be held accountable. And when politicians say someone must be held accountable, that essentially means that someone needs to get fired. As Henry suggests, I'm not sure that's going to be the political response here. It doesn't mean that others won't do it. And there have been other people. Kemi Badenoch has already said heads must roll. There are all sorts of other people in the political sphere who are making different demands. But in terms of the government itself, it doesn't seem to me, as Henry suggests, it's got quite that heat about it. I'm not for a second minimising it or saying this isn't consequential. But as far as the Labour Party is concerned, it doesn't feel like it's something they're really going to be banging the drum about.
And in process terms, by the end of Monday, because this is the deadline for the BBC to respond to this letter from the Select Committee, we could have Michael Prescott's original letter out in the public domain because Caroline Dinenage, the chair, asked to see it. She might want to publish it. We'll have Samir Shah, the chair's response, probably in black and white. There'll be a lot more clarity and a lot more stuff in black and white for people to scrutinise, as opposed to reporting about a letter and then people reacting to reporting. So it will all become a bit clearer.
It will become clearer, but the 14 pages of it has already been put out in the public domain by the Telegraph. Whether there is additional information that we see around the context and the way in which it was presented, I don't know. But look, you're right. We're recording it on Sunday morning. By this time tomorrow, it might appear very, very, very different indeed. And look, this is clearly a big deal. It is a big deal and a big problem. And what you see often, and to not to be a media correspondent either, I'm a political journalist rather than a media journalist, but we are also seeing a classic BBC thing, whereas it can take a number of days for the leadership to come out and respond. And politicians get frustrated by that. I'm sure members of the public get frustrated by that. And, this morning, of course, we asked if the Director General or the Chair wanted to come on the programme and talk about it, and they politely declined.
And also just one other thing to remember about BBC stories is that when politicians call for their colleagues or their opposite numbers to resign, that's politics. The BBC is an organisation with employees who have contracts and there are HR processes. So it's not as simple as just somebody in the BBC can be fired because of something on the front pages of the newspaper.
Yeah, and that happened after Glastonbury. There was clearly a mistake made there, but then the BBC had to go through exactly what had happened, exactly whose decisions it had been and what the consequences were going to be. But look, this is obviously a big deal, not least also because this has been noticed in the United States, where the White House has picked up on the fact that at the core of this story is that edit in Panorama. And the White House has used this to make the claim that the BBC is a 100% fake news. So this is not a nothing burger, to use whoever used that phrase originally on this podcast and made me laugh. But it's very unclear at this stage actually how it's going to pan out. And there'll be lots of reporting on it tomorrow across the BBC and other outlets.
Talking of reporting today, as a result of a certain BBC One programme on at 9 o'clock, now available to watch on iPlayer.
Yeah.
So as is tradition on Remembrance Sunday, you have a big, long conversation with the Chief of the Defence Staff. So like the most senior kind of military figure in the UK. Tell us some of the interesting things he said.
So Sir Richard Knighton, it was interesting anyway to talk to him because it was his first time. So today was his first moment at Remembrance Sunday as the top of the top brass. He was an aircraft engineer. He was then head of the RAF, and now he's the person at the top of the pyramid of our chiefs of the various military organisations in this country. So this is a massive job, and somebody with huge influence and huge power in Whitehall, and huge power to influence ministers also over exactly what they're doing when it comes to the safety of the country. So it was really interesting just to have him in the chair and hear him talk at length, which I hadn't done before. What he also committed news within just a couple of minutes of sitting down. He revealed that newscasters might remember last week, one of Belgium's main airports, the Brussels airport, well, Adam, had to shut because of drone attacks, buzzing drones, not dropping bombs, but drone buzzing suspected to be from Russia. And Sir Richard told us that British military personnel, not a big number, but about 20 or so, have gone to Belgium and they're sending kit and equipment and people to go and help the Belgians defend themselves from suspected Russian drone attacks. Now, given that it's very often we hear politicians and leaders talk about, we're in a pre-war stage. I think that was Grant Shapps' phrase. This is a new era of evolving threats. I was very struck by that. Brussels is 200 miles from London, give or take a few here and there. And the UK military is stepping in to help a country 200 miles from us deal with threats that are suspected to be from Russia. And I found that very striking indeed. On today of all days, also Remembrance Sunday, where people are thinking about the history and the legacy of wars in Europe. And then here, the UK getting involved in fighting off a profound threat of the modern era.
And let's hear a little bit of that conversation you had with Sir Richard Knighton.
I spoke to my Belgian opposite number in the week, and he asked if we would be prepared to support them. And the Defence Secretary and I agreed at the end of last week that we would deploy our people and our equipment to Belgium to help them. It is important to be clear, though, that we don't know, and the Belgians don't yet know, the source of those drones, but we will help them by providing our kit and capability, which has already started to deploy to help to Belgium.
We do some of this already because there's British forces in Estonia, and they call it the tripwire, don't they? It's like so if Russia was to do something dodgy in Estonia, British troops would be involved in dealing with that, and there'd be a wider response. But actually, this is a new type of assistance being provided to an ally in a new context.
Also, just to state the obvious, Estonia is a Baltic state right by Russia. Belgium is right by the UK, as Laura says. And I do, watching this whole fascinating interview and hearing, for the first time, as Richard Knighton said to Laura this, and just reacting myself, I do think, there's something of is it the boiling frog, the analogy that people often use in politics, where, the temperature gets turned up notch by notch on the frog and the frog doesn't realise it's boiling alive. I just think 4 years ago, 3 years ago, this headline would have appeared like something out of Brass Eye. Utterly fantastical, completely unimaginable in the 21st century. And I think it is just a moment, whatever the significance of these individuals, whatever the significance of these drones, whatever the symbolic or substantive importance of what is not very many military personnel being sent to Belgium, I think it is just one of those moments you have to think back and just think, gosh, things have moved a very long way very quickly in terms of war in Europe on the European continent in 2025.
I completely agree. And it made me think also of a couple of years ago after the Ukraine war began. We were lucky enough to go to Warsaw and we did an interview with the Polish leader at that point. And one of the things he said is, when we sit here, this threat is so different to how it feels to you at home. I'm paraphrasing because it's a couple of years ago. I can't remember his exact phrase in the interview. But even going there and having that conversation also felt very different than to us sitting there, and you're thinking, this is, a hop, skip and a jump from where we're sitting right now. There have been Russian bombs falling from the sky, Russian troops rolling over the border. So that whole background and context was so different to even seeing the, heart-rending images and frightening images, frankly, on the TV of what had happened in Ukraine. If you think now that our very near neighbours, in Brussels, and it's happened in Germany too, but in Brussels, which, as Henry says, is right by the UK, are being affected in a different way. These are buzz drones. This is not anything falling from the sky onto your house or onto whatever, but these are attacks suspected to be by the Russians on civilian infrastructure. And that's a very different thing to what we're used to seeing. And I think the boiled frogs point is exactly the right one. Just on whether or not it was actually Russia.
Yes.
Richard Knighton wouldn't confirm. Of course, you wouldn't expect him to do at this stage anyway. He said it was plausible that they were from Russia. And just to cut to the chase, essentially, the German defense minister has basically said they suspect it's Russia. The Belgians have said similar, but there isn't official confirmation on where these attacks are from. But the Shadow Defense Secretary, James Cartledge, kind of suggested, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it is a duck. He also was not able to confirm it for sure. But is that what the conventional thinking suggests? Yes, it certainly is.
And of course, Belgium is a small country with quite a small military, so you can see why they might ask another larger country with more capabilities to come and support them when they were dealing with a new threat.
And it's an example of NATO allies actually doing concrete things together, not just having summits and meeting together and saying, yes, we'll all stick together. This is an example of NATO allies actually going, we can put people on a plane, we can send you kit, we can do that, and we can do it really quickly.
Also, I should just say Brussels Airport is actually quite a nice airport, and it's 50 minutes from the town centre, and it costs €9 on the train. So it's very cheap and quick to get to.
Oh, dear.
Which puts things in perspective.
Well, that's one airport you and I spent plenty of time at, although we used to get the train much more than the airport. Anyway,
also,
there we are.
talking about money, quite a lot of your conversation with Richard Knighton was about defence spending and this fact that it's simultaneously going to go up by a huge amount by historical standards, but also at the same time, there will be news stories over the next few years about things being cut.
Yes, for
Just
sure.
explain what's going on there.
Okay, so there was a funny thing because the former top of the top brass, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, said in a speech in September that there were probably going to have to be cuts in the short term. And then last week, his old boss, John Healey, sat in the red chair in the studio and said, that's wrong. So we thought, well, let's ask the new guy what the truth is here. Now, the long and short of it, however Richard Knighton tried to kind of delicately dance around it, defence spending is going to go up by a lot in the coming years, by a huge amount. However, costs have gone up. Things like the NI bill for military staff have gone up. There's been inflation in the Ministry of Defence, just as there's been inflation for the rest of us. The Ministry of Defence has done things like send absolutely tons and tons of munitions to Ukraine. So their costs have gone up. And at the moment, the costs appear to have gone up quicker than the budget's gone. So there is what the Tories would say a black hole of £2.6 billion. So there are cuts. Things like marine training has been cut. Things like some cyber training has been shortened. And that is the truth of this, notwithstanding the fact that over the years, the budget is going to go up by an awful lot. So imagine that you've been told that in the next few years, you're going to get an absolutely whacking pay rise to spend on whatever you like. But this year, your electricity bill's gone up by 10% and your wages have only gone up by 5%. That gives you a bit of a flavour of what's happening. So when ministers say, oh, there are no cuts, that's simply not true. But it is important to see the bigger context that over the years, the amount of money available is going to go up by a lot. Not that we're sure how we're going to pay for it and how the government's actually going to meet their overall target.
Isn't there another bigger picture thing here, which is that over decades and decades and decades after the Second World War, and certainly as the Cold War gave way to what looked like peace, indefinitely, the amount of money that the UK spent on defence declined precipitously. At the same time, the amount of money that the UK spent on public services increased significantly. And now you have a situation where the government is talking again about increasing defence spending significantly, though not to anywhere near the levels that it used to be decades ago. And as we've seen in various ways, politics and the public are pretty resistant to decreasing spending on public services as a way of funding that. And so it's just yet another dilemma, isn't it? Or another difficult element of what is shaping up, and I'm sure we'll spend most of the next fortnight discussing it, for Rachel Reeves to be one of those most challenging budgets that any Chancellor has ever had to deliver.
Yeah, without question. And, it's when politicians say, this is a time when we must be war ready and we must have a national moment of endeavour and preparedness and we must understand how serious things are. But then I can't actually tell you how we're going to pay to make sure that happens. That's a political problem. It is a political problem and it's a difficult one. And there's a great pub quiz question for proper nerds about which year it was when NHS spending overtook defence spending. I think it was sometime in the 1980s and I can't remember which year it was, but I did used to know that fact. But I do just want to pick up on some of the conversation we had yesterday. We had a conversation this morning with the Culture Secretary and we showed the full interview, the full really heartbreaking interview with the mum, Megan Garcia, who we were discussing yesterday, Adam, whose son took his own life, she believes, because of a virtual relationship he'd had with a chatbot. I asked Lisa Nandy about this morning because she's the Culture Secretary. And it was interesting. She said, look, me and Liz Kendall, the Tech Secretary, are talking about whether or not the regulation in this area needs to go further. But she also did, quite an unusual thing, I think, for a politician. She's got a young boy. And she said, you know what, I sometimes can't sleep at night worrying about what he's seeing online. And you just wonder, as every week and every month goes by, this conversation just seems to me to be moving. And I also think it's harder and harder for people in government to resist calls from some people in their own party and the opposition to take a tougher line on some of the specific measures, like banning phones in schools, for example. So this debate is just going to keep going and going and going.
Although she did say in terms of a tougher line, she wasn't really looking at new laws on chatbots. It was more about what can the government and the regulators do to reinforce existing laws to make sure they apply to emerging areas.
That's right. And it's one of the things about the way the regulation was set up, and not to bore on about it, but we did touch about it yesterday. One of the things here is that Ofcom is sort of designed to be a collaborator and work with industry. So what I think ministers are trying to do is encourage them to be as sort of proactive and tough as they could be. And there's been criticism from Ofcom from a lot of quarters that they aren't being essentially brutal enough with the powers that they already have. But Henry, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's just, again, there are these issues where government in all sorts of ways are just struggling to keep pace with so many very dynamic changes.
Yeah, and I think it's clearly going to be one of the big policy challenges of the next few years and decades, and who knows how long hence, is that question of how to how the balance between regulation and economic opportunity and the very real human costs, as well as the human opportunities in this area. I don't think the government really knows, and I don't think any government really could know what direction they're going to end up going on this, because I think in some sense it's determined by where the tech ends up going and at what pace.
Really interesting. We had an academic on the programme with us this morning, Professor Gina Neff, who this is kind of her world. And her view was, look, actually the government doesn't have a choice. You've got to do both. But her concern is actually that the public will become dissatisfied and just worried and cross about the potential of AI if the harms aren't addressed. So, but she said, look, you can do both. And this sometimes, essentially suggesting it's a false choice to suggest you can do one or the other. And sometimes people who are mega gung-ho for saying economic opportunity, let's go, go, go. And you sort of hear the argument that, if you do anything in this, then you upset the tech companies and we can't put them off. She suggested very forcefully this morning, it's not a choice, and the requirement is for political leaders to do both.
And it was interesting watching Gina Neff on your programme this morning, because she was on Newscast when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, and he was holding his AI safety summit at Bletchley Park. And that's in an era where the government was emphasising the safety aspect of AI while still embracing the opportunities. But we sort of switched round now, and it feels like the government is embracing the opportunities, and the conversation about the safety is maybe been turned down a little notch.
If you want a clear example of that, Adam, Rishi Sunak, who chaired that summit, has written an article in the Sunday Times today, where he's now a weekly columnist, talking about how the government is being too cautious about embracing the opportunities of AI. So it seems like even he has moved in that direction, not to mention the government, which of course has changed party since he was Prime Minister.
And just very quickly on Rishi Sunak, he and his wife posted on Instagram this week for their charity, which is about numeracy and people being more comfortable with maths in their daily lives, where they're doing a maths quiz head to head. Wow. That is a competitive couple. And actually, I have to say, having watched Rishi Sunak for years, the thing that has revealed to me most just how competitive he is and what he must be like in a meeting when he's been presented with stuff by civil servants that he doesn't think is good enough, was revealed completely and so clearly in that video when he's up against his own wife. It's amazing. It's worth watching. And also, I learned a few things about maths from it too, which was their intention in the video. Right. Henry, talking about opportunities, have we signed you up for the 25-hour podcast-a-thon?
Not once, but twice. I'm starting to worry that you're already becoming forgetful, Adam, in advance.
It's a long list. It's a long list. So are you going to do 2 slots then?
Well, no.
No, we just asked you twice.
You've just asked me twice. Well, now 3 times.
Now 3 times.
But I don't know. No one's actually been in touch after each time that you've signed me up. So let's see with specific requests. But I'm sure I'll be there.
Well, I'm glad my people have been speaking to your people.
Oh,
yeah,
dear.
exactly.
Always exquisitely planned, perfectly delivered, ne'er an error nor a slip. I wish you luck. I'm going to try and join you if I can on Friday from wherever I may or may not be filming on Friday morning. But I wish you all the best, and I'll try and join you on a scratchy phone line, even if I can't get anywhere near a camera.
This is why it will be worth listening on BBC Sounds or watching on BBC iPlayer, because it's going to be 25 hours of unplanned chaos. It's going to be great. Touch wood. How much wood can I touch?
You say that to yourself, Adam.
Yes.
Newscasters, thank you for being with us as ever. Remember, we haven't said for a while, do keep in touch. You can always send us an email, newscast@bbc.co.uk. And we should also say on the AI conversation, remember, there's tons of help and support out there if you have been affected or are just a bit worried about any of these issues. And it's all directed from the BBC Action Line website.
Which is bbc.co.uk/actionline.
Adam, thank you for coming and chumming me at the weekend while Henry and I have been cruelly abandoned by Paddy. Not that he's doing something very important like commentary around Remember the Sunday, which he does.
He's amazing at that.
He is.
He's so good.
He's amazing at many things, including sitting in that chair. But it's been lovely having you sitting in it for a couple of days.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.